By the time he was 30 years old, he had never lost a battle. He had crossed from a small kingdom in the north of Greece into the greatest empire the world had ever known, and he had broken it. He had stood in the burning halls of the Persian kings. He had been hailed as a living god in the temples of Egypt. He had led his army farther east than any Greek had ever dreamed of going, over mountains, across rivers, into lands that were, to the people back home, the very edge of the world. And then, at the bank of one more river, in the rain, his soldiers stopped. Tonight, we follow one of the most astonishing journeys in all of human history, the march of Alexander of Macedon, the man the world would call the Great. We will meet him as a boy, taming a horse no grown man could ride. We will stand with him at 3 great battles, where he faced armies many times the size of his own, and won each time. We will follow him into the deserts of Egypt, to a lonely oracle where he was told a secret about himself that he never fully explained. And we will be there at the end, in the heat of Babylon, when the man who conquered the world could not conquer a fever, and died at 32 with no heir, and an empire too vast for any single hand to hold. It is a story of genius and ambition, of loyalty and murder, of a dream that carried tens of thousands of men to the ends of the earth, and of the price they paid to follow it. So make yourself comfortable, let the day fall away behind you, and come with me now, back more than 2,000 years, to a boy standing in a field, looking at a horse that everyone else had given up on. Welcome to Quiet History. I'm glad you're here tonight. This is a channel made for rest, where the long stories of the past are told slowly and gently to help you drift towards sleep. If these calm nights are good to you, a quiet tap on subscribe and like helps more than you know. Now settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let's begin. There are a handful of names that have never really faded, even after thousands of years. Names that were spoken with awe while their owners still lived, and have gone on being spoken ever since. Alexander is one of them. For more than 2,000 years, kings and generals have measured themselves against him. Some slept, it was said, with his story beside their beds. They wanted to know how a young man from the edge of the Greek world, ruling a kingdom that the great civilizations to the south had long looked down on as half barbarian, had gone out in a single short lifetime and conquered almost everything between Greece and India. Tonight we are going to follow that lifetime from its beginning to its end, slowly, the way you would follow a long road on foot. Not as a list of dates and battles, but as a story. The story of a real young man, brilliant and reckless and haunted, who believed there was no limit to what he could do and very nearly proved himself right. You do not need to hold on to the names of the places or the years. Let them wash past you. What matters is the shape of the thing, the rise and the reach and the fall, and the strange, restless spirit of the man at the center of it. Let the day grow quiet behind you now, and let us begin where he began, in the northern kingdom of Macedonia, in the house of a warrior king, with a boy who was not yet anything at all standing in front of a horse. Chapter 1. The Boy and the Horse. There is a story people told about Alexander when he was still a child, and whether or not it happened exactly as they said, it tells you what kind of boy the world believed he had been. A horse trader had brought a magnificent animal to the court of Alexander's father, the king of Macedonia. It was a huge, black-coated stallion, beautiful and clearly valuable, and the king's grooms went out to test it. But the horse was wild. It reared and shied and would let no one near it, and after a while the king waved it away, annoyed at having his time wasted by an animal no one could ride. And then a boy spoke up. Alexander, still a child, said that it was a shame to lose such a horse simply because the men were not clever enough or brave enough to handle it. His father, half amused and half irritated, asked whether he thought he could do better than his elders. The boy said he could, and a wager was made. Alexander walked up to the horse, and he did something none of the grooms had thought to do. He had noticed that the animal was frightened of its own shadow, shying every time the dark shape moved on the ground before it. So he took the reins and gently turned the horse to face directly into the sun, so that the shadow fell behind it, out of sight. He spoke to it and stroked it, and let it feel that he was not afraid. And when he felt the fear go out of the animal, he swung himself up onto its back and rode. His father, the story says, wept with a strange mixture of pride and unease, and told the boy that Macedonia would not be big enough for him, that he would have to go and find a kingdom worthy of his ambition. The horse was named Bucephalus, and Alexander would ride him for the next 20 years across half the known world, until the animal died of old age and wounds on the far side of the earth in what is now Pakistan, and Alexander wept for him and named a city after him. That story, true or embroidered, holds the whole man in miniature. The refusal to accept that a thing could not be done, the quick eye that saw the real cause of a problem when older men saw only the surface, the nerve to stake everything on his own judgment in front of a watching crowd, and the deep, almost tender bond he could form with the creatures and the men who carried him. All of it was there, they said, when he was still a boy. He was born in the summer, in the year we would call 356 before the Common Era, in the Macedonian capital of Pella. His father was Philip, a shrewd and ruthless king who had taken a weak, divided, half-respected kingdom and forged it into the most formidable military power in the Greek world. His mother was Olympias, a princess from a neighboring land, a fierce and passionate woman, deeply involved in mysterious religious rites, who filled her son from his earliest years with the belief that he was descended from heroes and gods, that the blood of Achilles and of Heracles ran in his veins, and that he was destined for something greater than any ordinary life. Between them, these two very different parents shaped him. From Philip he took the tools of power, the reformed army, the political cunning, the understanding of war. From Olympias he took the fire, the sense of destiny, the belief that he was not quite like other men. A boy raised on the certainty that he was born for greatness will often spend his life trying to prove it. Alexander spent his proving it on a scale the world had never seen. And he was given, for a few crucial years, one of the finest minds of the age to teach him. His father hired, as his tutor, the philosopher Aristotle, perhaps the greatest thinker of the ancient world. What passed between the young prince and the philosopher we can only guess at, but Alexander carried a love of Greek learning, of Homer, of medicine and science and the natural world with him for the rest of his life. He is said to have slept with a copy of the Iliad, the great poem of the Trojan War, beneath his pillow alongside a dagger. The poem and the dagger together, the dream of heroic glory and the means to pursue it, are as good an image of Alexander as any. That poem mattered to him more than we might easily understand. The hero of the Iliad is Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, a man who is offered a choice between a long, quiet, ordinary life that history will forget, and a short life crowned with undying glory, and who chooses the glory and the early death without hesitation. Alexander seems to have taken that choice as a kind of personal creed. He wanted, above everything, to be remembered, to do deeds that would be sung about for 1,000 years, and he was willing to pay for that with his safety, his comfort, and, in the end, his life. When you watch him later throwing himself into the most dangerous place in every battle, climbing first over an enemy wall while his terrified men hang back, you are watching a man who genuinely preferred a blaze of glory to a long, dull safety, and who had decided that as a boy, with a poem under his pillow, there was one more thing his father gave him, harder to name than an army or a tutor, and just as important. Philip gave him an example of what relentless ambition could achieve. Alexander grew up watching a man take something small and broken and make it great by sheer force of will and cleverness, year after year. He absorbed the lesson that the world was not fixed, that boundaries were only waiting to be pushed, that a determined man could remake the map. The son would simply apply that lesson on a scale the father had never imagined. But a boy with a destiny still needs a throne, and the throne would come to him sooner and more violently than anyone expected. Let the field and the horse fade now, and let us go to the day everything changed, the day his father was killed. Chapter 2: A Crown at 20. Philip had built something remarkable, and he had built it with a purpose. He had transformed the Macedonian army into a machine unlike anything its neighbors could field, and at the heart of it was a weapon of terrifying simplicity: the Macedonian phalanx. Picture a block of men, hundreds of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in deep ranks. Each carries a pike far longer than an ordinary spear, a great length of wood tipped with iron, so long that the points of the first several rows all project ahead of the front line at once. Seen from the front, the phalanx was a moving hedge of iron points, an advancing wall that infantry could not close with and survive, and Philip had paired it with fast, disciplined cavalry, striking from the flanks while the pikes pinned the enemy in place, hammer and anvil. The phalanx held the enemy fast, and the cavalry smashed into their side. With this army, Philip had made himself master of Greece. The proud old city-states, Athens and Thebes and the rest, that had once turned back the whole might of Persia, were beaten on the battlefield and brought under Macedonian control. And Philip had announced a grand design, a project to unite the Greeks behind him and lead them east, across the sea, against the ancient enemy, the vast Persian Empire, in revenge for the wars of long ago. He never went. In the year 336, at a great public celebration, in front of a crowd, Philip was struck down and killed by one of his own bodyguards. The reasons behind the killing have been argued over ever since, tangled up with court intrigue, personal grievance, and the poisonous rivalries of the royal household. What is certain is the result. In a single moment, the king was dead, and his son Alexander, 20 years old, was suddenly the ruler of Macedonia and the leader of Philip's unfinished war. 20 is very young to inherit a throne surrounded by enemies, and the enemies moved at once. There were rivals with their own claims who had to be dealt with quickly and often fatally in the brutal arithmetic of ancient succession. There were the Greek cities to the south who saw the death of the formidable Philip and the accession of a mere boy as their chance to throw off Macedonian control. And there were the wild peoples on Macedonia's northern borders who thought the same. Alexander answered all of them with a speed that stunned everyone. He secured his position at home, marched north and crushed the border tribes in a lightning campaign, and then, when the great city of Thebes rose against him in the belief that he was already dead, he descended on it before the news of his coming had properly spread. He took the city, and then he did something that sent a chill through the whole Greek world. He destroyed it. Thebes, One of the oldest and most storied cities of Greece was razed almost to the ground, its people killed or sold into slavery, its houses pulled down, only its temples and, by tradition, the house of a famous poet left standing. It was a calculated horror. Alexander was young and untested, and he understood that he could not afford to look weak. By making a terrible example of one great city, he frightened all the others into obedience without having to fight them. The lesson was brutal, and it was clear. This boy was not to be trifled with. Whatever he lacked in years, he did not lack in will or in the willingness to be merciless when he judged it necessary. It is worth pausing on how strange his position really was, because it makes what came after even more remarkable. Macedonia was not one of the celebrated centers of the Greek world. To the sophisticated citizens of Athens, the Macedonians were rough northern cousins, half Greek at best, more at home with horses and hunting and hard drinking than with philosophy and art. They were looked down on. And this half-respected northern kingdom, under a 20-year-old who had held his throne for only a matter of months, was now proposing to march against Persia, the superpower of the age, a state so vast and so rich that its yearly income dwarfed anything in Greece, whose king could raise armies from 20 different nations. By any sober calculation, it was madness. Alexander's whole kingdom could have been swallowed in a corner of the Persian Empire without anyone much noticing. He was deep in debt from his father's wars. His hold on Greece rested on fear rather than love. If he lost a single major battle far from home, everything would collapse behind him. And yet he does not seem to have doubted, even for a moment. That absolute, almost frightening self-belief is one of the keys to him. Where another man would have seen impossible odds, Alexander seems genuinely to have seen only an opportunity that had not yet been seized, and a story about himself that had not yet been written. Before he left, according to one famous account, he gave away almost all of his property and estates to his companions, distributing his wealth among them. When one of them asked in astonishment what he was keeping for himself, Alexander answered, "My hopes." It is the kind of line that may have been polished in the retelling, but it fits the man exactly. He was staking everything, holding nothing back, wagering a kingdom on his own hopes. With Greece cowed into silence behind him, Alexander turned to the great project his father had left unfinished, the invasion of Persia. He was young, he was in debt, his kingdom was small, and he was about to march against the largest and richest empire on earth, an empire that stretched from the coast of the Aegean to the mountains of India, that could field armies many times the size of his own, and that had ruled the heart of the world for 200 years. Almost no one, looking at the two powers side by side, would have bet on the boy. Let the burned ruins of Thebes fade behind us now, and let us go down to the sea, to the narrow water that divides Europe from Asia, and watch a young king prepare to cross it. Chapter 3. The Spear in the Sand. In the spring of the year 334, Alexander brought his army down to the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia, the crossing the Greeks called the Hellespont. On the far shore lay the Persian Empire and everything he had come to take. There is a story told about that crossing that is worth pausing on because it shows how Alexander understood the power of a gesture. As his ship approached the Asian shore, he is said to have thrown his spear from the deck so that it flew ahead of him and stuck upright in the sand of Asia. It was a symbolic act, and everyone watching would have understood it. In the old way of the Greeks, land taken by the spear was land held by right of conquest, owed to no one, granted by no treaty. Alexander was claiming the whole continent before he had set foot on it, Asia, he was saying, would be spear-won land, his by the sword and by nothing else. He came ashore with an army that was, by the standards of what it faced, not large, something on the order of 30 to 40,000 men, foot and horse together, a mixture of Macedonians and Greeks and allied peoples. Against them stood the resources of an empire that spanned 3 continents. But Alexander had advantages that did not show up in a simple count of heads. He had his father's superb army, tempered now under his own command. He had a corps of experienced officers. And he had himself, a commander of a boldness that bordered on recklessness, who led from the front, in the thick of the fighting, where his men could see him. The first great test came quickly, at a river called the Granicus. The local Persian commanders, the satraps who governed the western provinces, gathered their forces on the far bank to stop him. It was a strong position, a river to cross under fire, a steep bank held by the enemy. Cautious advisors urged him to wait. Alexander did not wait. He led the attack himself, plunging into the river at the head of his cavalry, driving up the far bank into the waiting Persians. The fighting was savage, and at its height, Alexander came within an inch of death. In the press of the melee, a Persian nobleman got behind him and raised a blade to strike the back of his unprotected head. The blow was already falling when one of Alexander's companions, an officer named Titus, cut off the attacker's arm and saved the king's life. Remember that name and that moment. Titus the Black, the man who saved Alexander at the Granicus. It will return years later in one of the darkest scenes of the whole story. The battle ended in a complete victory. The Persian line broke, and the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia were surrounded and cut down almost to a man. The western door of the empire had been kicked open. It is worth understanding why Alexander won that first fight, and so many after it, because the reasons repeat. Part of it was the army his father had built, the long pikes and the disciplined phalanx and the hard-charging cavalry, a system simply better than most of what the world could put against it. Part of it was the quality of his officers, men trained under Philip who could be trusted to hold a line or seize a moment without being told. But part of it, the decisive part, was Alexander himself and the particular way he fought. He led from the front. This sounds like a small thing, and it was not. Most great commanders of history directed their battles from a place of relative safety, where they could see the whole field and send their orders. Alexander did the opposite. He put himself at the tip of the cavalry charge, in the most dangerous place on the battlefield, and drove personally at the decisive point. It was reckless, and it nearly killed him more than once, as it almost did at the Granicus. But it did 2 things no safe general could match. It let him feel the exact moment when the enemy line was about to break and throw everything into that moment. And it made his men follow him anywhere, because they were never being sent into danger he would not enter first. An army will do extraordinary things for a king who bleeds beside them, and Alexander bled beside them again and again. Alexander sent captured Persian armor back to Athens as an offering, with a pointed inscription naming himself and the Greeks, and reminding everyone, at home and abroad, that the war of revenge against Persia had begun, and that it was going well. Through the following months he moved down the coast, taking the Greek cities of Asia Minor that had lived for generations under Persian rule, presenting himself not as a new conqueror, but as a liberator, freeing his fellow Greeks. Some cities welcomed him. Some had to be besieged, but the momentum was his, and the news of it ran ahead of him through the empire all the way to the ears of the man who sat on the Persian throne. That man was Darius, the 3rd king of that name, the great king, the ruler of an empire of many millions. And he had, at first, treated this Macedonian boy and his little army as a minor nuisance on the western frontier, a problem for his local governors to handle. The Granicus taught him otherwise. Now the great king himself would take the field, gather a royal army, and go west to crush the invader in person. The two kings were moving toward each other, and when they met, it would be at a place called Issus. Let the coast and the liberated cities fade now, and let us go to the first meeting of the two kings. Chapter 4. The King Who Ran. By the autumn of 333, Darius had assembled an enormous army and marched it west to find Alexander. What followed was a strange and almost comic prelude to a great battle. The two armies, each looking for the other, actually passed each other on different routes, so that for a short time Darius was behind Alexander, sitting across his line of supply and communication. When Alexander learned that the great king was now to his rear, he had to turn his army around and march back to face him. They met on a narrow coastal plain near the town of Issus, hemmed in between the mountains and the sea. And here the ground did something crucial. Darius had a vast army far larger than Alexander's, but the battlefield was cramped, a tight strip of land between the hills and the water. All those extra Persian troops had no room to spread out, no space to bring their numbers to bear. The very size of the royal army, its greatest strength on an open plain, was made useless by the narrow ground. Alexander understood exactly what to do. He anchored his line, held the Persian masses in place with his phalanx, and then led his cavalry in a hammer blow aimed directly at the weak point in the enemy line and, beyond it, at the great king himself. Alexander had grasped the truth about the Persian army that would decide this battle, and the next one. It was built around its king. Darius was not only the commander, he was the heart and the symbol of the whole host. If the king fell or fled, the army would lose its nerve. So Alexander went straight for him. He drove his charge through the Persian ranks, cutting toward the tall figure of Darius in his war chariot at the center. And as the Macedonian cavalry hacked closer, and the men around him began to fall, the great king's courage failed. Darius turned his chariot and fled the field, and then abandoned even the chariot and rode for his life on horseback, throwing off his royal cloak and weapons so as not to be recognized. When an army sees its king run, it comes apart. The Persian host, so vast a few hours before, dissolved into a panicked mob streaming back through the mountain passes, trampling its own men in the crush. Alexander had won again more completely than anyone could have believed, against the great king in person. And in the captured Persian camp he found something that would test his character as much as any battle. Darius, marching to war as kings then did, had brought his family with him, and in his headlong flight he had left them behind. Alexander's men captured the great king's mother, his wife, and his children. What Alexander did with them became one of the most famous parts of his legend. He did not humiliate them, or harm them, or treat them as the spoils of war. He gave orders that they were to be honored and cared for according to their royal rank, that nothing was to be taken from them, that they were to keep their household and their dignity. There is a story that when the captive queen mother, meeting Alexander and his close companion Hephaestion together, and not knowing which was the king, bowed by mistake to the taller Hephaestion, and then froze in terror at her error, Alexander only smiled and told her she had made no mistake at all, because Hephaestion too was Alexander. Whether or not it happened just so, the story captures how he wished to be seen, not as a barbarian raider, but as a magnanimous king, worthy to rule the empire he was taking. Darius, safe but shattered, sent letters offering terms. He offered ransom for his family, and then a share of his empire, a great sum of money, and the hand of his daughter, if only Alexander would stop and make peace. One of Alexander's oldest and most trusted generals, hearing the offer, is said to have remarked that he would accept it if he were Alexander, and Alexander is said to have replied that he would accept it too if he were that general. He would not stop. He did not want half the empire, or a treaty, or a marriage alliance. He wanted all of it. That exchange, whether or not the words were exactly as remembered, marks the moment Alexander's ambition slipped past anything his father had dreamed of. Philip had wanted to free the Greek cities of Asia and perhaps seize the western provinces of Persia, a large but limited aim. What Darius was now offering him was, in effect, everything Philip had ever wanted, handed over without further fighting. Half the Persian Empire, a fortune, a royal marriage, peace with honor. It was a stunning offer, and any reasonable conqueror in history would have taken it and gone home a legend. Alexander refused it because his ambition had no natural stopping point. This is the thing that separates him from almost every other conqueror, and it is not entirely an admirable thing. For most people, even most ambitious people, there is a level of success that finally feels like enough, a point at which the striving can rest. Alexander seems never to have had that point. Each victory did not satisfy the hunger, it fed it. Beyond every horizon he reached was another horizon, and he had to have that one too. It made him unstoppable, and it would, in the end, help destroy him, because a man who can never say enough will keep going until something outside him, an army's exhaustion or a fever in Babylon, says it for him. But between Alexander and the heart of Persia lay the coast, and on that coast stood a city that would cost him more time and more effort than any battle. An island fortress that believed itself untouchable, rising out of the sea, Tyre. Let the battlefield of Issus grow quiet, and let us go to the walls that rose from the water. Chapter 5. The Island That Would Not Kneel. Instead of chasing Darius east at once, Alexander did something that seems, at first, strangely patient for so restless a man. He turned south down the coast to secure the whole eastern shore of the Mediterranean before pushing inland. His reasoning was sound. The Persian navy was still strong, and if he marched deep into Asia while leaving the coast and its ports in enemy hands, that navy could cut his supply lines, stir up Greece behind him, and strangle his campaign from the rear. To win the land, he first had to take the sea, and to take the sea, he had to take its harbors. Most of the coastal cities opened their gates. One did not. Tyre. Tyre was an ancient and immensely wealthy Phoenician city, and it was built in a way that made it feel invulnerable. The main city stood on an island, set back from the shore, ringed by high walls that rose straight out of the deep water. It had defied besiegers before and outlasted them, because there was, quite simply, no way for a land army to get at it. The Tyrians looked out from their island at Alexander's soldiers on the beach and felt safe. They offered him a polite, limited friendship, but they would not let him enter the island city itself. They thought the sea would protect them, as it always had. Alexander's response was one of the most audacious feats of engineering in the whole history of ancient warfare. If he could not reach the island across the water, he would reach it across the land he made. He ordered his army to build a causeway, a great solid mole of stone and timber and earth, straight out from the shore toward the island, across the open sea. Think about what that meant. Tens of thousands of men hauling rock and felling timber, driving the road out into the waves, deeper and deeper, while the defenders on the walls rained down arrows and firebombs and sent ships to attack the workers from the flanks. The Tyrians fought the causeway every way they could. They burned the wooden towers Alexander built on it. They churned the sea. At one point, a storm helped tear the work apart, and each time Alexander widened it, rebuilt it, pushed it on. He gathered warships from the coastal cities that had come over to him until he had a fleet that could challenge the Tyrian navy and pin it in its harbors. He brought up siege engines on ships and on the growing mole and battered at the walls from every side. The siege lasted 7 months. 7 months of grinding, dangerous, exhausting work, of assaults thrown back and tried again, of a whole army bent to the single task of reaching an island that had told it no. It became, for Alexander, a matter of will. He had staked his reputation on taking the city, and he would take it, whatever the cost and however long it took. In the end, the walls were breached from the sea and from the mole at once, and the Macedonians stormed in. What followed was terrible. After 7 months of losses and frustration, the army showed little mercy. Many of the Tyrians were killed, and many of the survivors were sold into slavery. It was, like the destruction of Thebes years before, partly a punishment and partly a message, meant to be heard all along the coast. This is what happens to a city that defies Alexander. After Tyre, the road south lay open, and the remaining cities thought hard before closing their gates. That causeway, by the way, never went away. Over the centuries, sand and silt gathered against Alexander's mole, widening it until the island of Tyre was joined permanently to the mainland. It is a peninsula to this day. The siege of Tyre tells you something about Alexander that the great open battles do not. Anyone can admire a brilliant charge on a battlefield, a single day of genius and courage. Tyre was the opposite of that. It was 7 months of grinding, unglamorous, frustrating labor, of a plan that kept failing and having to be begun again, of men dying slowly in ones and twos rather than gloriously in a great clash. And Alexander simply would not let go. The same will that drove him across continents drove him to spend most of a year defeating a single stubborn island because it had told him no, and he could not accept a no. There is something almost frightening in that persistence, and it is a large part of why he succeeded where others failed. Most commanders, faced with a fortress as strong as Tyre and a task as enormous as building a road across the sea, would have found a reason to move on, to call the city not worth the cost, to declare a partial victory and march away. Alexander's mind did not work like that. Once he had decided a thing must be done, the difficulty of it seemed only to harden his resolve. It was the same quality that had made a boy insist he could ride a horse grown men had given up on. Turn the problem until you find the angle no one else has tried, and then refuse absolutely to stop. It won him an empire. It would also one day march an army into a killing desert rather than admit that a road could not be walked. The shape of that stretch of coast, more than 2,000 years later, is still the shape that one stubborn king carved into the sea because a city told him he could not reach it. With the coast secured behind him, Alexander turned toward a land that had been waiting quietly to see which master the future would bring. A land of temples and deserts and a river older than memory, Egypt. Let the sea and the broken walls of Tyre fade now, and let us follow him south into the oldest country in the world. Chapter 6. The Son of the God. Egypt did not resist him. For generations it had chafed under Persian rule, and when Alexander arrived, the Egyptians received him not as a conqueror, but as a deliverer, the man who had driven out the hated Persian governors. He was welcomed, honored, and, in the ancient manner of the country, treated as its new pharaoh, the latest in a line of god kings that stretched back thousands of years. For Alexander, Egypt was a turning point, and not only in a military sense. Two things happened there that would shape the rest of his life and the whole future of the world. The first was a city. On the flat coast where the Nile met the Mediterranean, Alexander chose a site and founded a new city, laying out its streets and walls himself, and he gave it his own name, Alexandria. He could not have known what it would become. Within a few generations, Alexandria would grow into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a center of trade and learning, home to the most famous library the world had ever seen, a meeting place of Greek and Egyptian and Jewish and countless other peoples, a lighthouse of the mind for centuries. Of all the many cities Alexander founded across his empire, and there were many, this was the one that truly outlived him, and it carried his name through all the ages that followed. It carries it still. The second thing was stranger and more personal, and we understand it less. From the coast, Alexander set out on a long and difficult journey into the western desert, to a remote oasis called Siwa, where there stood a famous and very ancient oracle of the god the Egyptians called Amun, whom the Greeks identified with their own supreme god, Zeus. It was a hard road across waterless sand, and there are stories that the party lost its way and was saved by sudden rain, or guided by birds, or by some other sign. Alexander seems to have been driven to make this journey by something deep in himself, a need to ask the god a question, or to hear an answer. What passed between Alexander and the oracle, no one truly knows. He went into the sanctuary alone, and he never fully revealed what he was told. But from that time onward, a belief clung to him, and he did not discourage it. The belief that he was, in some sense, more than the son of Philip, that he was the son of the god. The priests of Amun, it was said, had greeted him as the god's own son, and Alexander appears to have taken this deeply to heart. To understand why this mattered so much and caused so much trouble later, you have to understand the gap between two ways of seeing a king. In the Greek and Macedonian world Alexander came from, a king was a man. A great man, perhaps, favored by the gods, descended in legend from gods even, but still a mortal, who ruled with the rough consent of his warriors and could be argued with, drunk with, and, if it came to it, killed. In the older world of Egypt and the East, a king could be something else entirely, a sacred figure, the living point where the divine touched the earth, worshipped rather than merely obeyed. Alexander was now trying to be both at once, and the two did not fit together. To his new Eastern subjects, a king who was the son of a god was exactly right, natural, reassuring. To his Macedonian soldiers, it was unsettling and faintly ridiculous, and as he leaned into it more and more, it began to feel like a betrayal of everything they understood a king to be. The man who came out of the desert at Siwa carrying a new idea about his own divinity was, without quite realizing it, beginning to grow apart from the very men who had made his conquest possible. The god of Egypt and the king of the Macedonians were becoming harder and harder to hold in one body, and the strain would eventually break out in quarrels, in a murdered friend, and in a court full of resentment. We should be careful here, because this is where legend and history blur, and where a modern listener has to hold the story at a slight distance. Whether Alexander sincerely came to believe he was divine, or whether he found the idea politically useful, or some tangled mixture of both, is something historians still argue about and cannot finally settle. In the world he was conquering, kings were often held to be more than human, and a ruler who claimed a god for a father spoke a language his new Eastern subjects understood. But there was also clearly something in Alexander himself that reached for this. The boy raised by his mother on tales of divine descent, who slept with Homer beneath his pillow and modeled himself on the half-divine heroes of legend, was perhaps always going to hear, in the words of an oracle, the confirmation of a thing he already half believed. Whatever the truth of it, he came out of the desert changed, carrying a new and dangerous idea about himself, an idea that would delight his eastern subjects and trouble his Macedonian soldiers, who had known him as a man and a comrade, and did not care to kneel to him as a god. That tension between the Macedonian king and the would-be god of Asia would grow through the years to come and would end in blood. But first there was unfinished business. Somewhere to the east, Darius was still alive, gathering one more army, the largest yet, for a final stand. The two kings had one more battle to fight, and this time there would be no narrow ground to save the smaller force. This time they would meet on an open plain that the great king had chosen himself. Let the desert and the oracle fade behind us now, and let us go east, to the last battle for the throne of Persia. Chapter 7. The End of Persia. In the autumn of 331, the two kings met for the last time, on a wide plain in the north of what is now Iraq, near a place called Gaugamela. This time Darius had prepared the ground with care. He had chosen a broad, flat battlefield, and he had even had parts of it leveled and cleared, so that nothing would hinder the weapons he was counting on to win the day. He had gathered an army from across the whole vast empire, larger than the one Alexander had scattered at Issus, and he had brought terrible instruments to break the Macedonian line. Scythed chariots with blades fixed to their wheels, meant to tear bloody lanes through the massed infantry, and war elephants, animals most of Alexander's men had never faced. By every measure of numbers, Darius should have won. He had chosen the field, he had the greater force, and he had weapons designed for exactly this fight. And he lost completely because he was facing the finest tactical mind of the age. Alexander's plan at Gaugamela was a thing of cold brilliance, and it turned on a deliberate risk. Knowing he would be badly outnumbered and in danger of being surrounded on the open plain, he arranged his army not as a simple line, but as a flexible, angled formation, with reserves and guards on the flanks and rear, ready to bend without breaking. And then he did something that looks, at first, almost mad. He led his own cavalry not straight at the enemy but off to one side, edging further and further to the right, drawing the Persian left wing out after him, stretching and pulling at their line. He was fishing for a gap. As the Persians shifted and extended to match his movement, a hole began to open in their formation. And the instant it opened, Alexander wheeled his best cavalry into a single concentrated wedge and drove it straight through the gap, aimed once again at the heart of the enemy, at Darius himself. The scythed chariots, when they were launched, largely failed. Alexander's men had been told how to deal with them. They opened lanes in their ranks and let the chariots hurtle harmlessly through, then closed around them and dealt with the crews. The great weapon that was meant to shatter the phalanx rattled through it and achieved almost nothing. And at the center, it happened as it had happened before. As Alexander's wedge cut toward him and the fighting closed in, Darius, the great king, ruler of an empire that had stood for 200 years, lost his nerve a second time and fled. Once more the sight of the king in flight broke the will of his army. The greatest host Persia could feel dissolved, and Alexander was left master of the field and of the empire. Darius ran, but he did not run to safety. He fled east into the mountains with what followers he had left, a king without an army, and there his own end found him. His remaining nobles, led by one of his kinsmen, turned on him. They arrested their own king, and as Alexander pursued them, closing fast, they killed Darius and left his body behind, hoping to buy their own escape. When Alexander's men came upon the fallen great king, he was already dead or dying, abandoned by his own people on a lonely road. There is a story that Alexander, finding the body of his great rival murdered and cast aside, was genuinely moved, that he covered it with his own cloak and ordered that Darius be given a royal funeral, buried with honor among the tombs of the Persian kings. Whether from real feeling or from a shrewd sense of how a new king of Persia ought to behave, Alexander chose to mourn his enemy rather than gloat over him. And he hunted down the men who had killed Darius and put them to death as traitors and regicides. He was no longer only the conqueror of Persia. He was claiming to be its rightful king, avenging the murder of his predecessor. Along the way, he took the great capitals of the empire and their fabulous treasuries, wealth beyond anything the Greek world had ever imagined. And at the ceremonial heart of Persia, the palace city of Bucephalus, something happened that has been argued over ever since. The magnificent palaces of the Persian kings were burned to the ground. Whether it was a deliberate act of policy, a symbolic revenge for the Persian burning of Greek temples long before, or whether it began as a drunken impulse at a wild feast and ran out of control, the sources disagree. But the result was certain. The ancient ceremonial capital of Persia went up in flames, and with it, in a sense, the old order of the world. Gaugamela deserves a moment's reflection because it is often called one of the most brilliantly won battles in all of history, and the reason is instructive. Darius did almost everything right on paper. He chose the ground, he cleared the field for his chariots. He gathered overwhelming numbers, he prepared weapons designed specifically to defeat Alexander's army. And it made no difference at all because Alexander understood something Darius did not, which is that a battle is not won by numbers or by weapons but by finding, in the chaos of the moment, the one decisive point and striking it with everything you have. Everything Alexander did that day, the strange sidelong march that stretched the Persian line, the calm holding of his flanks under terrible pressure, the patient waiting for a gap, and the sudden violent lunge through it toward the king. All of it served that single idea. He was not trying to kill the whole Persian army, he was trying to break one man's nerve, at one place, at one instant. And when the gap opened and he drove for Darius, and Darius ran, the battle was decided, even though most of the enormous Persian host had not yet even been engaged. It is a lesson that has been studied by soldiers ever since. Force is not the same as strength, and the largest army in the world is only as steady as the will of the man at its center. Alexander had done what he set out to do. At perhaps 25 years old, he had destroyed the Persian Empire and made himself Lord of Asia. He could have stopped. Any ordinary ambition would have been not merely satisfied but overwhelmed. He did not stop. And the man who would not stop began now to change in ways that frightened the men who had followed him from home. Let the flames of Persepolis fade now, and let us look at what victory was doing to the victor. Chapter 8: Becoming what he conquered. An empire is easier to conquer than to rule. Alexander had shattered Persia on the battlefield, but now he had to govern it, a realm of countless peoples, languages, and customs, stretching farther than he could ride in months. And the way he chose to do it opened a wound in his own army that never fully healed. Alexander understood something that many conquerors never grasp. He could not rule millions of Persians and Medes and Bactrians as a foreign occupier forever, holding them down by force with a few tens of thousands of Macedonians. If his empire was to last, the peoples he had conquered had to be brought into it, given a place, made partners rather than only subjects. So he began, deliberately, to blend himself and his rule into the world he had taken. He started to wear elements of Persian royal dress. He adopted parts of the elaborate ceremony of the Persian court. He kept Persian officials in their posts, took Persian nobles into his service, and began training young Persians to fight in the Macedonian way. He took an eastern wife, Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian lord, and later would marry Persian princesses as well, and encourage his officers and men to take eastern wives, trying to knit the two worlds together by blood. To the Persians, this was the behavior of a proper king, but to many of his Macedonians, it was something close to betrayal. These were men who had followed him from home, who had bled for him at the Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, who thought of him as their king in the old Macedonian way, first among equals, a comrade who drank with them and joked with them and led from the front. Now they watched him dressing like the enemy they had died to defeat, surrounding himself with Persian courtiers, expecting Eastern forms of respect. They felt he was slipping away from them, turning into the very thing they had crossed the world to destroy. The tension came to its worst over a matter of ceremony. In the Persian court, those who approached the great king performed a gesture of deep obeisance, a bow that could go all the way to the ground. To the Persians, this was simply how one behaved before the king, and carried no sense of worshipping a god. But to the Greeks and Macedonians, that kind of prostration was something you did only before a divinity, never before a man, however great. When Alexander tried to introduce the custom at his court, his own men balked. To bow to Alexander like that, some of them felt, was to call him a god to his face, and they would not do it. The attempt caused such resentment that Alexander eventually let it drop, but the bitterness remained. And then there was the night that showed how dangerous the mixture of wine, pride, and wounded feeling had become. At a feast, deep in drink, Alexander and one of his oldest officers fell into a violent argument. The officer was Clytus, called the Black, the same man who years before had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, cutting down the Persian who would have killed him. Now, drunk and angry, Clytus threw the king's new Persian ways in his face, taunted him, reminded him bitterly that it was Macedonian blood and old Macedonian comrades who had made him what he was. Alexander, just as drunk and stung to fury, seized a weapon and killed him. Ran him through, in the middle of the feast, an old friend, the man to whom he owed his life. The moment the rage passed, Alexander was overcome with horror at what he had done. The stories say he tried to kill himself, that he shut himself away and would not eat for days, wild with grief and guilt. He had murdered the friend who had saved him over words spoken in wine. It is one of the darkest moments in his life, and it shows the other face of the man. The same intensity that made him unstoppable in war made him terrifying in anger, capable, in a single unguarded moment, of destroying what he most valued. The tragedy of Alexander's later years is that his greatest political insight and his deepest personal flaw were tangled together and could not be separated. The insight was real and ahead of its time. He genuinely understood that a lasting empire could not be a Macedonian occupation of a resentful East, that the conquered had to be made partners, that Greek and Persian would have to become, over generations, one people under one rule. The mass marriages, the training of Persian soldiers, the blending of courts and customs, all of it was aimed at a future that was, in its way, visionary. Had it worked, it might have created something genuinely new and durable. But he was trying to build that future on top of an army of proud, tired, homesick men who had not signed up for it, who had crossed the world to beat the Persians, not to become them, and who felt, with every Persian robe he put on, that they were being quietly replaced in their king's heart. Alexander never solved that problem. He oscillated between his soldiers and his vision, indulging the Macedonians and then pushing the Eastern policy again. And the tension curdled into the drunken rages and the bitter scenes that scar his final years. He could see further than his men, but he could not carry them with him to where he saw, and a leader who leaves his followers behind, however clear his vision, is walking toward a cliff. This was Alexander now, master of the world, and increasingly a stranger to the men who had won it for him. Half Macedonian king, half Eastern lord, brilliant and generous and beloved, and also proud and drunk on his own success and dangerous. And still, after everything, not finished. Because beyond the old Persian Empire lay more land and more rivers, and Alexander had convinced himself that he could reach the very edge of the world, the great ocean that the thinkers of his time believed encircled all the lands of the earth. So he turned his tired, victorious army east again toward India. Let the feast and its grief fade now, and let us follow him to the last of his great battles at a river swollen with monsoon rain. Chapter 9. The Elephants at the River. To reach India, Alexander led his army over some of the hardest country in the world, through the high passes of the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, fighting stubborn hill peoples, enduring cold and hunger and thin mountain air. By the time he came down into the plains of the Punjab, in the region of the 5 rivers, he had been on campaign for years, and his men had marched thousands of miles from home. But Alexander pressed on, drawn by the belief that the Eastern Ocean, the end of the world, could not be far beyond. In the Punjab he found a land of local kingdoms, some willing to submit or ally with him, others ready to fight. The greatest of those who chose to fight was a king, the Greeks called Porus, a ruler of striking presence, said to have been a giant of a man who commanded a powerful army on the far side of a river. The Greeks named the Hydaspes. And that river, when Alexander reached it, was a formidable obstacle in its own right, running high and fast, because the monsoon had come and the rains had swollen it. Porus drew up his army on the far bank to stop the crossing, and at the heart of that army stood something Alexander's men truly feared. War elephants, a long line of them, huge and armored, meant to terrify the horses and trample the infantry. Alexander's cavalry had never fought well against elephants, because horses panic at the smell and sight and sound of them. Porus had built his defense around exactly that fear. What followed was, in the judgment of many, the most difficult battle Alexander ever fought, and the finest display of his generalship. He could not force a crossing straight into the teeth of that army and those elephants, so he tricked Porus. For night after night he made noise and movement up and down the near bank, marching men about, so that Porus was kept on edge and then gradually lulled into treating the disturbances as nothing. And then, on a night of wind and heavy rain, with the storm covering the sound, Alexander took part of his army far upstream and crossed the swollen river at a point Porus was not watching, and came down on the flank of the Indian army before it could properly react. The battle that followed was long and hard and bloody, fought in mud against the elephants, against brave and determined troops. Alexander used every trick of his craft, harassing the elephants with missiles until, maddened and wounded, they turned and trampled their own side as much as the enemy, opening the Indian formation to his cavalry and phalanx. In the end, he won, but it was a costly victory, and it was not the rout of Issus or Gaugamela. It was a stand-up fight against a worthy enemy, and it left a deep impression on him. It was in this campaign that old Bucephalus died. The great black horse that Alexander had tamed as a boy, that had carried him across the entire known world, from Macedonia to the far side of the Persian Empire and beyond, came to the end of his long life here, in the heat and mud of India, worn out or wounded in the fighting. Alexander grieved for him as for a friend, and founded a city on the spot and named it after the horse, Bucephalus, so that the animal who had carried him to the edge of the world would not be forgotten. And there was Porus himself. Captured after the battle, the defeated king was brought before Alexander, who asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus, this beaten prisoner facing the master of the world, is said to have answered with magnificent dignity that he wished to be treated as a king. And Alexander, who admired courage above almost anything, was so struck by the man that he not only spared him but restored him to his throne and made him a friend and ally and gave him even more land to rule than he had held before. It was the same instinct that had made him honor the family of Darius. Alexander respected greatness in an enemy and preferred, when he could, to win such men over rather than simply crush them. It is worth staying a moment with the strangeness of where he now was. Alexander had marched his men clean off the edge of their own world. To a Greek of that age, India was a place of rumor and legend, the far rim of the earth, a land of monsters and marvels at the boundary of the known. There were no reliable maps, no real knowledge of what lay ahead, only stories. And Alexander had led his army into it, across mountains and rivers no Greek army had ever crossed, into a climate they did not understand, the drowning heat and the endless rains of the monsoon, which rotted their equipment and sapped their spirits and killed men with strange fevers. And still at the Hydaspes against elephants and a determined king on ground utterly foreign to him, in the middle of a monsoon he had found a way to win. That is perhaps the truest measure of his generalship. It is one thing to win on familiar ground against a familiar enemy. It is another to win at the far edge of the world, in the rain, against war elephants, with an army that had been marching for the better part of a decade. But it was also the moment his luck and his men's endurance had stretched as far as they would go. The victory over Porus was magnificent, and it was the last great battle he would ever fight, because just beyond it waited not another enemy, but the quiet, immovable refusal of his own exhausted soldiers. Beyond Porus's kingdom, Alexander wanted to march on, further east, always further east, toward the ocean he was sure lay just beyond the next horizon. But he had reached a limit at last, and it was not an enemy that stopped him, it was his own men. Let the river and the elephants fade now, and let us go to the place where the army for the first time told its king no. Chapter 10. The river where the army Said number Goth. They had followed him for 8 years. They had marched from the northern edge of Greece to the plains of India, thousands upon thousands of miles, across mountains and deserts and rivers, through a dozen great battles and countless smaller fights. They had seen friends die and grown old on the road, and many of them had wives and children they had not seen in the better part of a decade, if they had ever seen them at all. They were rich now, laden with the plunder of an empire, but they were exhausted in a way that plunder could not cure, and they were a long, long way from home. At a river called the Hyphasis, the easternmost point of the whole expedition, they stopped, and they would not go on. Alexander wanted to keep marching east. He spoke to them of the glory that still lay ahead, of the ocean at the edge of the world that he believed was close, of the deeds they could still do together. But this time the old magic did not work. The men had heard, from the local people, that beyond the next rivers lay vast lands and powerful kingdoms with enormous armies and thousands more war elephants, more country than they could imagine, stretching on and on. And something in them simply gave out. They did not mutiny in fury. According to the accounts, it was quieter and sadder than that. They fell silent, they wept. Through one of their respected officers, they told him, with a kind of weary love, that they had done enough, that they had followed him further than any army had ever followed any man, and that they wanted at last to go home. Alexander did not take it well. He argued, he pleaded. He is said to have shut himself in his tent for days, as he had done after the death of Clytus, refusing to come out, waiting for his men to change their minds, unable to believe that the army which had never failed him would fail him now. But they did not change their minds. And in the end, for the first and only time, Alexander gave way. He announced that the gods, through sacrifices, had shown the omens were against going on, giving his men a way to turn back that did not shame either them or him. The great eastward march was over. They would go home. But going home was not simple, and Alexander did not choose the easy road, and here the story turns very dark. Rather than return the way he had come, he decided to march a large part of his army back through a terrible desert, along the coast of what is now southern Iran, a waste of burning sand and no water. Why he chose that route has been debated ever since. Perhaps to punish the army for defying him, some have said, though that is probably too harsh. Perhaps out of the old need to do what others said could not be done, to conquer even the desert. Whatever the reason, the crossing of that desert was a catastrophe. Thousands died of thirst and heat and hunger, men and the women and children who followed the army, dropping in the sand left behind. Alexander is said to have shared the sufferings of his men, and there is a famous story that when a little water was found and brought to him in a helmet, he poured it out into the sand rather than drink while his soldiers went thirsty. But no gesture could undo the toll. He had beaten every army that faced him, and been beaten at last only by the earth itself. The mutiny at the Hyphasis is one of the most human moments in the whole story, and it is worth sitting with, because it is where the legend touches something we can all recognize. For years, these men had been more than an army. They had been the instrument of one man's impossible dream, and they had made that dream real, marching further and fighting harder than any soldiers in memory. And at the last river, they discovered the limit not of their courage, but of their hope. They simply could not believe any longer in the ocean at the edge of the world. They wanted to grow old somewhere warm and familiar, to see their children, to stop. There is no shame in what they did, and the accounts do not treat it as shameful. It is one of the few times in the story when ordinary human feeling, weariness and homesickness and love of ordinary life stands up to the superhuman ambition of Alexander and, quietly, wins. He could outfight any enemy, but he could not argue the simple exhaustion of the men he loved and needed. And perhaps there is a kind of justice in the fact that the only force that ever truly stopped Alexander was not a greater king or a stronger army, but the accumulated tiredness of the very men who had carried him so far. The march that no enemy could halt was halted, in the end, by love of home. The survivors came at length out of the desert and back into the settled heart of the empire, and Alexander turned to the enormous task of ruling what he had won. But the strains that had been building for years now broke into the open again. At a city called Opis, when Alexander announced plans that seemed to favor his new Persian troops and to send some of his old Macedonian veterans home, the army rose in bitter protest, feeling once more that their king was casting them aside for the foreigners they had conquered. This time Alexander faced them down with a mixture of fury and emotional appeal, executing ringleaders, then shutting himself away, then staging a great public reconciliation and feast, weeping and embracing his men, trying to bind the two halves of his world, Macedonian and Persian, back together. He was a man trying to hold together by sheer force of will and personality, something that was perhaps too vast and too divided to hold. And he was tired and grieving and not yet 33 years old. The years of wounds and marches and drinking and loss were pressing down on him. And then, in the space of a few months, the two blows fell that would end everything. Let the desert and the weary army fade now, and let us go with him to Babylon for the last time. Chapter 11. Babylon. The first blow was the loss of the person he loved most in the world. Hephaestion had been at Alexander's side since boyhood. He was his closest companion, his most trusted friend, and by every account the one human being Alexander loved above all others, so close that Alexander had once said of the queen's bow to the wrong man, that Hephaestion too was Alexander. In the city of Ecbatana, Hephaestion fell ill with a fever and, within days, died. Alexander's grief was volcanic, beyond all measure and almost beyond reason. The accounts describe him flinging himself on the body, refusing to leave it, refusing food, cutting his hair in mourning, ordering extravagant honors, planning a funeral monument of staggering scale and cost. He was inconsolable in a way that frightened those around him. The man who had conquered the world had lost the one person who made the world bearable, and he did not know how to survive it. Some who knew him thought that after Hephaestion's death, something in Alexander was already broken, that he had lost the will to guard his own life. A few months later, in Babylon, the second blow fell. Alexander, in the midst of planning yet more campaigns, new conquests, a great expedition by sea, was taken by a fever. It came on after a long night of feasting and drinking, and at first it did not seem alarming. But it did not pass. Day by day it deepened. He grew weaker and hotter, and at last could not speak. His soldiers, desperate and disbelieving, filed past his bed one by one, so that each could see their king a final time, and he could no longer greet them except, it was said, with his eyes. And then, in the summer of the year 323 before the Common Era, in the ancient city of Babylon, far from the Macedonia where he had tamed a wild horse as a boy, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. We do not know for certain what killed him. A fever, some illness caught or carried, perhaps made fatal by years of hard living and old wounds and the weakening grief of the months before, is the likeliest answer, and the one most historians accept. But almost at once the whispers began, and they have never entirely stopped, that so young and so mighty a man could not simply have sickened and died, that he must have been poisoned by enemies at his own court. There is no proof, and probably no truth, in the poison stories. But they tell you how impossible it seemed to the people of his time that Alexander could die at all. He left no clear heir. His wife Roxana was carrying a child who would be born after his death, a son, but an infant king is no king at all in a world of ambitious generals. There is a famous story that as Alexander lay dying, unable to speak clearly, his officers asked him to whom he left his empire, and that he answered with his last strength to the strongest. Whether he truly said it or not, it was prophecy. Because the moment he was gone, his great generals, the companions who had conquered the world at his side, turned on one another and tore his empire apart. They fought over his body and over his provinces and over his infant son, and in the end they carved the empire into pieces and made themselves kings of the fragments. Alexander's family, his wife, his mother, his son, were all, within a few years, murdered in the wars of succession, every one of them, so that no descendant of Alexander survived to inherit anything at all. The empire that one man's will had held together fell apart the instant that will was gone, exactly as, twice the Persian army had fallen apart the instant its king had fled. And yet, here is the strange thing. The reason we are still telling this story more than 2,000 years later. The empire died, but the world Alexander made did not. His conquests had flung the Greek language and Greek art and Greek thought across an enormous swath of the earth, from Egypt to the borders of India, and mixed them with the older cultures of the East into something new. Cities he founded became centers of learning and trade for centuries. Alexandria in Egypt grew into the intellectual capital of the ancient world. For hundreds of years after his death, in lands he had passed through once as a young man in a hurry, kings spoke Greek, and Greek and Eastern gods were worshipped side by side, and ideas traveled along roads his armies had opened. He had wanted to reach the edge of the world. Instead, in a sense, he had joined its halves together. Historians have a name for the long age that his conquests opened. They call it the Hellenistic period, the centuries after Alexander, when Greek culture spread across and mixed with the older civilizations of the East, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. It was, in many ways, one of the most creative eras of the ancient world. In the cities he and his successors founded, Greek and Egyptian and Babylonian and Persian and Jewish and countless other traditions met and argued and blended. Mathematics and astronomy and medicine flourished. The great library of Alexandria gathered the knowledge of the world under one roof. Ideas, art, coins, gods, and words traveled along roads that had been opened by a young man's spears. None of that was what Alexander intended. He did not march east to spread learning or to mingle cultures for their own sake. He marched east because he could not stop, because there was always another horizon, because a boy who slept with Homer under his pillow wanted to outdo Achilles and be remembered forever. The great civilizing consequences of his conquest were, in a sense, an accident, the unplanned aftermath of one man's boundless hunger. And yet they were real, and they outlasted every kingdom his generals carved from his corpse. The empire he built died with him. The world he stirred together did not, and we are, in ways we rarely notice, still living in the long echo of it. What are we to make of him in the end? He was, beyond any argument, one of the most gifted commanders who ever lived, a man of astonishing courage and vision and charm, who inspired tens of thousands to follow him to the ends of the earth. He was also the author of terrible destruction, of razed cities and slaughtered thousands, and a desert full of the bodies of his own people, driven by an ambition that no victory could ever satisfy. He could be magnanimous to a fallen enemy and murderous to an old friend, generous and vain, tender and terrifying, sometimes within the same day. He was not a simple hero, and he was not a simple monster. He was something rarer and more unsettling. A human being with almost no limits placed upon him, neither by the world nor by himself. And the story of what such a person does with such freedom is one we have never stopped needing to tell. He set out as a young man to see how far he could go. The answer, it turned out, was almost to the ends of the earth, and not quite to the age of 33. Let him rest there now, in Babylon, in the summer heat, young forever, the boy who tamed the horse, the king who conquered the world and could not keep it, sleeping at last after the longest march in history. And so the great march ends where all marches end, in stillness. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight, and for letting the long story of Alexander carry you towards sleep. If it brought you a little calm, you can subscribe and leave a gentle like, so that these slow nights can find their way to others who are looking for rest. And if you are still awake, here is a thought to carry into sleep. If you could have followed him just once to the top of one of those far mountain passes and looked out at a land no one from your world had ever seen, would you have gone on? Or would you, like his soldiers at the last river, have turned quietly for home? Next week, we will drift together into another chapter of the human story. Until then, rest well and sleep deeply. Good night.